On 6th December 1942, 23 aircraft came home from Eindhoven with birds still punched into their airframes. That isn't a weather anecdote. Birds don't cruise at 3,000 feet. They collide with aircraft only when the aircraft is among them, below the tree lines, below the drainage ditches, in the same low strip of air where starlings scatter in winter fields and lapwings work the bare till. 23 bird strike returns from a single mission isn't misfortune. It's altitude evidence. The operation was called Oyster. 93 light bombers from No. 2 Group, Royal Air Force, took off from bases across Norfolk on a Sunday morning specifically chosen to minimise Dutch workers at their stations. The target was the Philips radio and vacuum tube works at Eindhoven, 70 miles inland from the Dutch coast, well beyond the range of any available fighter escort. The attack ran on time. The Stripe Works tower clock stopped at 12:32 in the afternoon, struck still by the concussion of the first bombs. 14 aircraft never came back. Those two numbers, 23 damaged by birds, 14 lost from the combined force, are the operational record of Operation Oyster. Read correctly, they are also a measurement instrument. What they measured in the flatlands over the Netherlands that December was exactly how thin the margin had become for the men flying Mosquitos at low level in daylight. Start with where those men lived before they flew. Number 105 Squadron RAF had been at RAF Horsham St Faith outside Norwich before the United States Army Air Forces took over the station in September 1942. A Facebook archive photograph caption, "Confirmation confirms the squadron was still flying Mosquito B Mark IVs from Horsham St Faith in September of that year," which makes the timing plain. When the Americans arrived, the RAF cleared out. Both 105 and 139 squadrons relocated to RAF Marham, a bomber station on the open Norfolk Flats west of King's Lynn, in late September. A specific date of 29th September appears in 139 squadrons' basing history, though whether both squadrons moved simultaneously or in close succession isn't fully resolved in available records. What is established is that 105 was conducting operations from Marham by the 2nd of October 1942, and a photograph taken on 11th December that same year confirms the squadron was there. By the time Oyster was being planned in November, both squadrons had been in residence for roughly 2 months. Marham in late 1942 wasn't a comfortable headquarters. The station sat in flat fenland country, low-lying and frost-prone in December, the kind of Norfolk ground that looks grey-brown from above in winter and whose drainage channels appear as thin silver lines at low altitude. The two Mosquito squadrons operated Merlin-engined B Mark IV bombers, wooden-framed, unarmed aircraft with no defensive guns, no armour, and a 2-man crew. Pilot and navigator, side by side in a cockpit that felt intimate by the standards of the 4-engine heavies operating from other East Anglian bases. The aircraft's whole argument was that it didn't need armour or guns. It was fast enough not to be caught. No. 2 Group was the sole specialist day bomber force within Bomber Command. 10 medium bomber squadrons flying Venturas, Bostons, Mitchells and Mosquitoes. Its doctrine was specific. Get in low, get in fast, hit a single industrial or infrastructure target with precision, get out before the defences fully register. The premise of survival was speed and surprise, not altitude and armour. For the Mosquito crews at Marham, this wasn't an abstract doctrinal preference. It was the operational reality they had been living since May 1942, when 105 Squadron flew its first operational Mosquito sortie, 4 aircraft against Cologne on 31st of May and announced the type to the British public. By December, both 105 and 139 were flying the same operations from the same station. The 139 Squadron Wikipedia entry records their Mosquito service beginning at Horsham St Faith in September 1942, moving immediately into the low-level lane that 105 had been carving since the spring. A formation photograph from the period identifies the two squadrons together. BIV's 139 and 105 squadrons were part of two-group bomber command and operated as precision low-level bombing raids for the first year of operations. This is the world Oyster came from. Not bomber command in the abstract, but two squadrons on one Norfolk airfield, sharing a doctrine, sharing a lane, flying the same unarmed aircraft in the same kind of weather. Wing Commander H.I. Edwards, VC, DSO, DFC, commanding officer of 105 Squadron, led the Mosquito detachment on Oyster. 8 aircraft from 105, 2 from 139. 10 Mosquitoes in a combined force otherwise made up of Venturas and Bostons. 10 aircraft, 20 men, in a formation of 93. They were the fastest element, the ones the plan assigned the most flexibility on the return route, the ones who weren't bound to the other aircraft for the return trip once the bombs were gone. The plan recognized their different capability and used it. What the plan couldn't fully account for was what would happen between the coast and the target at 50 feet above the ground. The Oyster Force had been training for this specific raid since early November. Full-scale practice runs were flown over England, large formations at low level, bombing mock targets. The first trial run was disappointing. Aircraft arriving from different directions at different times. Venturas in a ragged formation that demonstrated immediately how difficult it was to maintain station at treetop height with the propeller wash of the aircraft ahead trying to knock you sideways. A second trial run with all forces on 20th November went better. The Mitchell squadrons, 98 and 180, were eventually pulled from the raid entirely because their crews weren't ready for operations this demanding. The force came down to 8 squadrons of 3 types. During those training flights, the planners confronted something that would follow them to Eindhoven. Birds on the coast tended to be larger, the Wikipedia account of the raid records, and when startled by the noise of an aircraft engine, they would take off into the air. The risk of bird strikes was one of two groups' greatest dangers. This was a known hazard. It appeared in the planning documents. The No. 2 Group staff had seen it happen on earlier operations and identified it as a structural risk of the low-level technique. What the December mission would demonstrate was that knowing a risk exists and controlling it are different problems. On the morning of 6th December, the weather over Eindhoven was declared favourable. The raid had been delayed since 3rd December, when the Meteorological Office found conditions unsuitable. 3 days of sitting in closed stations, no mail out, telephones guarded, crews briefed and rebriefed on a target they couldn't discuss, until Sunday brought flyable weather over the Netherlands. Takeoff began between 11:15 and 11:30 in the morning. The Southwold Lighthouse guided the Bostons and Mosquitoes out over the North Sea, while the Venturas routed slightly south over Orfordness Lighthouse. The formation flew below 100 feet across the water. At that altitude over the North Sea in December, the propellers threw spray. The horizon is close, and the water looks dark and fast. There is no comfortable vantage point from which to assess the formation's geometry, just the aircraft ahead of you and the sea rushing below. 45 minutes to the Dutch coast. The coast appeared as what the Wikipedia account describes as a thin smudge on the horizon, Landfall was intended at a small town called Kolijnsplaat, at the mouth of the Oyster estuary on the north coast of the island Beveland. The leading Bostons came in low over the inlet. German flak batteries on the coast were taken by surprise and managed only scattered fire as the formation passed. Then the estuary. The Bostons followed their track up the Oosterschelde, hugging the north coast for 30 miles to reach Bergen op Zoom. And in the estuary, the birds were waiting. Not waiting in any purposeful sense. They were doing what they always do on a December afternoon in the Netherlands. Feeding, resting on the mudflats, flying in low, dense flocks between roost sites and foraging grounds. The estuary of the Oosterschelde is one of the larger tidal inlets on the Dutch coast. In winter, it holds dense populations of waders, gulls, ducks and geese, birds that feed on the exposed mudflats as the tide ebbs and gather in rafts on the water when it floods. They had no context for what approached. The sound preceded the aircraft at such low level by only a fraction of a second. The Wikipedia account is specific about what happened next. The first hazard arose in the form of seabirds, which were startled by the sound of the aircraft approaching and rose into the air. The risk was known, but the number and size of the birds was greater than anticipated. A mass of birds flushing off an estuary at a sudden noise doesn't rise uniformly. Some birds bank away. Others climb directly into the path of whatever frightened them. At the speeds the Oyster formation was flying, the geometry of any bird that rose into the flight path was instantly lethal, for the bird and potentially for the aircraft. As the aircraft flew through them, the account continues, some birds shattered windscreens, penetrated cockpits and injured aircrew. Others bent fuel pipes and caused wing damage. The record then narrows to one specific aircraft. 2 gulls, large coastal birds, the kind that weighs nearly a kilogram, smashed through the nose perspex. The navigator in that aircraft took the impact in his legs. The force of the brake at that airspeed sucked his maps out of the shattered windscreen, and they were gone instantly. Caught in the slipstream, scattered over the estuary. He had no charts for the rest of the mission. He navigated to Eindhoven and back from memory, from the mental image of the route he'd studied during the weeks of briefings in closed stations. Whatever he was thinking, as he sat in a broken cockpit with glass fragments and bird matter around him, injured, charting a course through his own head, he held his nerve and kept the aircraft on track. The Ventura formation followed 3 minutes behind the Bostons. On the coast, the Germans had had those 3 minutes to recover and man their guns. The Venturas had also missed their intended landfall, arriving a mile south over Walcheren instead of the intended crossing point, directly over a more heavily defended stretch of coastline. The heavy flak that had barely touched the Bostons was now ready and accurate. A Ventura was hit and crashed into the sea. A second was hit in the cockpit, the pilot wounded, put the aircraft down in a ploughed field. A Focke-Wulf 190 from Woensdrecht, returning from the air battle over Lille, where the diversionary US AAF raids were being contested, came down on another Ventura and sent it into the Zeeland Peninsula. The Mosquitoes were following the Boston route. As the formation turned inland, the Focke-Wulfs could be seen taking off from Woensdrecht airfield, banking toward them. One pilot described watching them with a kind of dissociation. They looked so normal, just like Spitfires taking off in England, that it was hard to realize they were coming up to kill you. Squadron leader D. Parry and Flight Lieutenant W. Blessing turned toward the incoming fighters, closed in a moment, were fired upon, and pushed the throttles forward. The Focke-Wulf 190, at low altitude, has a similar maximum speed to the Mosquito, but it had to climb from rest to intercept an aircraft already at cruise speed. The Mosquito's margin was measured in the seconds it took the German pilot to build velocity and close angle. Hugging the ground, the formation continued southeast. They kept low, the Wikipedia account records, rising up slightly to help clear hedges and houses. Pilots and navigators pointed out trees, chimneys, high-tension cables, and other obstructions to avoid. For the navigators in particular, this was continuous work. Not the map and compass navigation of higher altitude, where a landmark can be read a mile ahead and approached at leisure, but instantaneous recognition and immediate call. Canal ahead, tree line right, pylon, bank left. At 300 miles per hour, a feature visible at a half mile is upon you in 6 seconds. The navigator, who'd lost his maps to the Oyster gulls, was doing all of this from memory. There is no record of what he said in that cockpit. There doesn't need to be. The stripe clock stopped at 12:32. Now look at what those instruments were measuring alongside the geography. The force that flew Oyster wasn't homogeneous. It comprised 3 aircraft types with meaningfully different performance characteristics. 47 Venturas, the slowest aircraft in the formation, operating close to their maximum range at Eindhoven. 36 Bostons, 10 Mosquitos. The loss breakdown by type is the operational argument about speed, stated in numbers. 9 of the 47 Venturas were lost, a loss rate approaching 19%. 4 of the 36 Bostons, roughly 11%. 1 of the 10 Mosquitos, 10%. In pure percentage terms, the Mosquito and Boston loss rates aren't dramatically different from each other. But the damage picture changes the interpretation entirely. 37 Venturas sustained damage in addition to the 9 lost, meaning roughly 96% of the entire Ventura force was either destroyed or came home damaged. 13 Bostons were damaged beyond the 4 destroyed. 3 Mosquitos were damaged. 6 of the 10 Mosquitos came home completely untouched. The Mosquito was the fastest and the Ventura the slowest, the dedicated monograph on the raid records. And the shortcomings of the Ventura were exposed, and the loss rate on bombing operations was heavy. Same route, same target, same flak batteries on the coast, same Sunday afternoon, same 10 minutes over Eindhoven. The Ventura crews and the Mosquito crews flew through the same birds and the same German defences. The Mosquito element came home 6 for 6, undamaged. The reason is mechanical. At 300 miles per hour, a low aircraft traverses 440 feet per second. A flak crew, detecting that aircraft at 1,500 meters slant range, roughly 3 seconds of warning if they're sharp, has somewhere between 4 and 8 seconds of usable engagement window before the aircraft is passed. Reduce that aircraft's speed by 50 miles per hour and the window extends by several seconds. Several seconds is the difference between a flak gunner getting a tracking solution and not getting one. The Ventura's lower speed gave German light automatic weapons more of those seconds. Its larger silhouette gave them a bigger cone of probability. More hits, higher damage rate. The Mosquito closed the clock faster. The Memorial Flight Club account notes, there were surprisingly few losses and little damage caused by German fighters, the bombers proving difficult targets at ultra-low level. One Mosquito, fired on by Focke-Wulfs that scrambled from Wurmsdrecht, pushed the throttles, abandoned its bombing run, and eventually lost the fighters near the coast. The FW-190's attack geometry against a low-level aircraft is inherently constrained. It can't dive on an aircraft at 50 feet without putting itself into the ground, restricting it to stern or beam approaches where the target aircraft speed is most advantageous. The Mosquito's margin wasn't invincible. One Mosquito didn't come back, but the margin was real, and Oyster measured it. Now measure the birds as instruments. The 464 Squadron RAAF Operations Record Book was matter-of-fact about what came home. All machines and some members of crews suffered damage, with birds, seagulls and ducks being brought back jammed in various positions, with some penetrating the perspex. Not some aircraft, all machines. The contemporary RAF newsreel, produced within weeks of the raid, put a specific number on it. Most of the other aircraft are damaged, 23 by bird strikes. Wing Commander Ronald Hildyard Young, AFC, the commanding officer of 464 Squadron, who led the Ventura formation that day and was awarded the DSO for it, confirmed the same figure after the fact. Some 23 aircraft were damaged, not by enemy fire, but by bird strikes from their low-level operations. The codenames.info operational summary echoes it. No fewer than 23 of them by bird strikes. The Memorial Flight Club's post-war account, working from fuller squadron records, revises the figure upward. At least 31 of the aircraft had bird strikes, some hit trees, and several Venturas probably hit buildings whilst bombing through smoke. The difference between 23 and 31 most likely reflects what you count. Only aircraft with structural damage requiring repair, or every recorded bird contact, including minor strikes. The contemporary operational figure sits at 23. The fuller accounting reaches 31. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire attacking force. Here is why those numbers are diagnostic rather than incidental. Modern aviation safety datasets, compiled by the FAA, EASA, Transport Canada, and military bird aircraft strike hazard programs over decades and hundreds of thousands of reported incidents, converge on a consistent pattern. A European synthesis of global strike data found 95% of all strikes occur below 2,500 feet, with 70% occurring below 200 feet. The FAA's National Wildlife Strike Database found over 90% of strikes below 3,000 feet and approximately 70% below 500 feet. For every 1,000 feet gained above 500 feet AGL, bird strike likelihood decreases by approximately 32%. A US Air Force risk assessment for military airfields confirmed that altitude was the primary driver of strike risk. Aircraft operating at low level were consistently more likely to encounter birds. None of that analysis existed in 1942, but the birds themselves were the same. The birds flying through the Oyster formation over the Oosterschelde and across the Dutch polderlands weren't high-altitude migrants on nocturnal flight paths. Long-distance nocturnal migration for small passerines occurs at 1,500 to 3,000 meters altitude, predominantly at night. A midday December raid at 12:30 in the afternoon intersects something completely different: winter foraging behavior. Common starlings form dense foraging flocks at ground level in farmland and pasture during winter daylight hours. A wind farm baseline study conducted off the North Sea coast found their typical transit flight altitude reaching a maximum of roughly 200 meters, 660 feet, with foraging at ground level. They leave their roosts at first light, disperse to fields and lawns and pasture to feed through the morning and afternoon, and return before sunset. At 12:30 on a December afternoon, they are in the fields. They aren't at altitude. When the Bostons arrived over the estuary at low level, the starlings working the polderland behind it were precisely in the flight path. Northern lapwings concentrate in winter on lowland agricultural land, winter cereals, bare till, waterlogged pastures. The Netherlands around Eindhoven is exactly this habitat: flat polder country, drainage channels, open fields. In December, lapwings don't move to altitude. They move to where the ploughed earth is softest and the worms are near the surface. Their display flights involve a low climbing element and a steep dive, brief, low, and concentrated in small vertical space. Wood pigeons, boosted in winter numbers by northern migrants, feed in large flocks on the ground. Their courtship display involves climbing rapidly to 20 or 30 meters above the ground, 60 to 100 feet, then gliding down. At 100 feet AGL, a formation of aircraft closing at 440 feet per second is already past that altitude before the bird has time to process that it's there. Over the estuary itself, the species profile changes. Coastal gulls and waders, the large birds that caused the most catastrophic strikes, the ones that shattered windscreens, rest on tidal mudflats and take flight in dense, low, disorganized masses when disturbed by sudden noise. A mass of panicking gulls over the Oyster at the moment the first Bostons cross the coast isn't something any pre-raid planning table could quantify. The number and size of the birds was greater than anticipated, the operational account states. Greater than anticipated is another way of saying the estimation was wrong. The inference from the bird strike count is bounded. It doesn't permit calculating the precise altitude to within 10 feet, but the argument holds. Between 23 and 31 aircraft returning with birds embedded in their airframes on a midday December mission over flat Dutch farmland and a major tidal estuary is strongly consistent with the attacking force spending its transit in the altitude band where the overwhelming majority of bird strikes occur. Below 500 feet. Almost certainly below 200 feet for significant portions of the approach. Every independent historical account confirms below 100 feet as the documented transit altitude. The bird strike count is consistent with this, and it verifies it with biology that doesn't lie. The birds aren't adding information the operational record doesn't already contain. They are calibrating it. They are the instruments that tell you the instruments in the cockpit were reading what the pilots said they were reading. After Oyster, number 2 group stood down for 10 days. Not because of loss rates alone. 14 aircraft from a formation of 93 was grievous, but it was the kind of grievous Bomber Command had learned to absorb. The stand down was partly because of the bird strike damage. 37 Venturas, 13 Bostons, 3 Mosquitos. Aircraft with broken perspex, bent fuel lines, birds still lodged in engine bays and cowlings. The ground crews at Marham and at Feltwell and at Swanton Morley spent the December week after Oyster removing the evidence, pulling feathers from engine inlets, patching noses, checking for hydraulic damage where impacts had stressed fuel and control runs. It took 10 days before the group was operational again. The birds grounded a significant fraction of a bomber force. The post-raid analysis reached a clear verdict on the Ventura. The type had flown Oyster at an 18% loss rate and returned from it with practically its entire force either destroyed or damaged. Wing Commander Peter Dutton, commanding 107 Squadron's Bostons, was shot down and killed in the approach phase, his Boston going into the sea off Katwijk aan Zee. The Australian 464 Squadron and the New Zealand 487 Squadron, among the Ventura units, had between them lost aircraft on the first crossing of the Dutch coast before the target was even visible. The type couldn't sustain that arithmetic on repeated missions. The whole premise of No. 2 Group's daylight precision doctrine, the low, fast, unescorted strike, depended on the survival calculation closing in the aircraft's favour. Oyster showed how close to breaking even that calculation had become, and it showed which end of the speed range was winning. Now look at the engine. By late 1942, the certified performance of the Mosquito B Mark IV was known at Marham to be close to the operational edge. The twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering the aircraft were governed to certified boost limits, maximum manifold pressures set below the actual detonation threshold of the fuel-air mixture in the cylinders. Those limits were conservative by design. Detonation at high cylinder pressure, uncontrolled ignition that drives cylinder pressure beyond design limits, destroys engines catastrophically and without warning. Certified boost limits were set with a buffer against variation in fuel quality between batches and manufacturing tolerances between individual engines. The gap between the certified maximum and the actual detonation point was real. It was intentional. And in the operational environment of late 1942, it was a reserve someone noticed. Secondary accounts attach the name Rod Banks to what followed. A mechanic, according to one description, described in forum accounts as the architect of a shadow modification network at Marham. The boost controllers on 105 Squadron Mosquitoes were reportedly modified to push the boost setting beyond its certified limit. The operational record accounts that first attached his name to this practice claim the modification yielded roughly 25 to 30 miles per hour of additional speed, pushing modified aircraft from a baseline of approximately 380 miles per hour toward 405 to 410 miles per hour at altitude. The same accounts report modified aircraft loss rates running at roughly 0.33% per sortie compared to approximately 0.6% for unmodified aircraft. These specific figures aren't independently verifiable in the sources available. They originate in operational accounts, not re-audited primary records, and should be understood as claimed rather than confirmed. But they are the figures attached to Banks's name in every account that mentions him, and Oyster gives them their context. 25 miles per hour at low level isn't a brochure improvement. At the engagement windows available to German light flak crews tracking a fast aircraft across a flat Dutch field, 25 additional miles per hour shortens the available seconds meaningfully. It puts the aircraft past the gun position faster. It makes the Focke-Wulf's stern chase harder to close. The margin at Oyster was already tight enough that it registered in the comparative loss rate between Mosquitoes and Venturas flying the same mission, the same day, the same altitude. Every fraction of that margin counted. And because the doctrine required the aircraft to be where the birds were, below the tree lines, among the winter foraging flocks, there was no option to buy that margin through altitude. The only available direction was faster. Certified boost limits are set below the actual detonation point for good engineering reasons. When the operational need is acute enough, the gap between the certified limit and the real limit stops looking like a safety reserve and starts looking like a performance asset someone has already calculated and decided to spend. Here is the case laid out plainly. You can approach Oyster as a story about the Phillips factory, a successful industrial raid, severe damage to the Stripe and Emma-Single complexes, 6 months of disrupted production, a military success against a legitimate target with high civilian cost. You can approach it as a story about No. 2 Group's operational ambitions. But if you approach it as a story about the bird strike count, between 23 and 31 aircraft returning with birds embedded in their airframes and their perspex, you get a measurement instrument pointed directly at the aircraft's operating altitude. The biology isn't ambiguous. Starlings and lapwings and fieldfares and coastal gulls don't soar at altitude in December. They are on the ground, or close to it, during mid-afternoon foraging hours. When they rose into the path of the formation over the Oyster and the polder fields behind Bergen op Zoom, they recorded exactly where the aircraft were. They recorded it in broken perspex, in bent fuel lines, in the navigator of one aircraft who sat in a fractured cockpit with his charts blown away and found his way home across 70 miles of occupied Netherlands using the map he carried in his head. Every Mosquito crew on Oyster was a pilot and a navigator. No gunners, no bomb aimer, no flight engineer. Just two people in a cockpit whose size made the aircraft feel like a fast car rather than a military machine. The navigator's job at 100 feet and 300 miles per hour over flat Dutch terrain was visual landmark acquisition, second by second. Tree lines, canal banks, roads, farm buildings, read them, triangulate, call the next waypoint before the one you just used is already a mile behind you. When the gulls came through one navigator's nose perspex and his maps went with the wind, he kept working. He identified landmarks from memory. He called headings. He got his crew over the target and home. One Mosquito crew didn't come back. The single aircraft among the 14 lost. That is 2 men, a pilot and a navigator, whose names the operational accounts available here don't supply. Their absence sits against the 9 Ventura crews and 4 Boston crews who also didn't return, and the airmen the raid cost in total. All of them flew the same low-level transit, saw the same Dutch flatlands at window height, and entered the same 10 minutes of sky above Eindhoven. The crews who didn't return are the human denominator of the arithmetic the bird strike count was measuring. The bird strikes the survivors brought home are the most forensically specific thing the operation left behind. Not flak pattern reports, not fighter engagement records, birds. Still present in the airframes when the aircraft taxied in. Seagulls jammed in engine bays, ducks in the perspex. The 464 Squadron ORB didn't labour the point, it just wrote it down. Birds, seagulls and ducks being brought back, jammed in various positions, with some penetrating the perspex. Laid against the altitude distribution of bird strikes in modern aviation safety databases, those returns confirm what the operational accounts already stated about the approach altitude, and they quantify it with the simplest possible evidence. The aircraft were in the birds' air. The birds were in the aircraft. The boost modification was the operational community's answer to that measurement. If the doctrine required flying at the biological floor, if there was no alternative approach altitude that preserved both the flak suppression advantage of low level and the speed advantage of the Mosquito, then every additional knot the Merlin could give without destroying itself was a fractional improvement in the survival arithmetic. The gap between certified boost and actual detonation existed for sound engineering reasons. In late 1942 at Marham, someone looked at that gap, looked at the loss rates, looked at the bird strikes jammed in the airframes of aircraft that had just survived, and concluded the engineering reserve was available. Oyster confirmed the arithmetic. The birds were the instruments that measured it. The modification was the answer. Subscribe for more stories like this.